There's 4 basic ingredients in beer, and barley malt is one of them. Brett, where does Urban Artifact get their malt?
Well, Mike, that's a great question because I thought you were going to ask me what the other 3 ingredients in beer were, and I was prepared to say flesh, blood, and bone.
That one comes out in October.
But when I'm buying my malt, I buy from Malt Europe because they make the best quality malt at the best possible price. Some of the best breweries in the world use Malt Europe, and I am proud to say that Urban Artifact is one of those breweries.
Do you have to be a commercial brewery to use Malt Europe malt?
You don't. You can head down to your local homebrew store and you can find a wide selection of Malt Europe malts there. So if you're a pro brewer or a home brewer alike, get the best value, the best product at the best price. Get Malt Europe.
And they support us. So Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, owner and brewer at Urban Artifact in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am here today with the one and only Michael Morgan. Mike, how the hell are you?
I just cracked open one of America's greatest cheap, mass-brewed, mediocre beers, and I am feeling ham-tastic.
There's nothing like a good cold glass of carbonated ham water.
Yeah, it's good enough. It's the beer that I like.
Is that the official tagline? It's good enough?
It would be a great... one of my favorite taglines for a beer was Schaefer out of Detroit was the beer to drink when you're having more than one. And that was their real tagline. It's the closest thing ever to just when you want to get shit-faced and you don't have a lot of money. Schaefer.
They knew their audience.
Yeah.
You got to give them that.
Yeah. So hams, if you'd like to pay me for good enough, I will take the check.
I never really knew what ham-fisted meant until I guess just now.
What? Well... Sure. I don't know that was the original meaning, but it's what it means for me.
Well, let's get ham-fisted together.
But sometimes I'm too ham-fisted.
My wife says that every once in a while.
So this is the second episode where we're doing a little retrospective, looking back at how beer came to be watery and yellow and not that good by the time we were into the 1970s.
Why did craft beer need to get created in America?
Right. Why was everything else so mediocre and so similar? And as we said in the last episode, that really involves going back to the 1870s. But let's back up and recap just a little bit of where we left off, which is Prohibition. And during Prohibition, we have a few different things that are happening. I mean, obviously, the biggest one is that it's illegal to run a bar or make beer. That's pretty huge. But we also have this thing that people are homebrewing, but they're homebrewing with these malt extracts that have almost no hops in them, and they would have been syrupy, and you would have used bread yeast to mix with them. And the beer would have sucked.
The prepackaged wink, wink, don't tell, we definitely aren't doing this on purpose type things.
Right. So the beer would have not been good. It would have been malty. So it would have been sweet. It wouldn't have had any level of bitterness or hop note to it. So by the time you get through the 13 years that's Prohibition, if you're still drinking beer, what you think of as beer is malty and sweet, and it's not very good. It's kind of...
mildly alcoholic grain soda is basically what you've been making.
Yes.
If you're still drinking beer.
If you're still drinking beer.
And chances are you've probably moved on to the harder stuff, to cocktails, to what America created and is known for.
And those cocktails, as we discussed, they start with predominantly bad homemade liquor, moonshine, taste awful. So you have to mix it with fruit juices and other forms of sugar to make it palatable. And in addition to that, a lot of the breweries stayed alive in part by making these malt extracts. A lot of them went to making sodas. Some of them converted to making ice cream. Some of them started making candy. So what we did was trade alcohol for sugar during Prohibition.
Yes, alcohol as it was being consumed was all about efficiency in Prohibition. You needed the efficiency of transport, so you didn't want to transport a bunch of water around, which is basically beer and wine. You needed the efficiency of getting drunk quickly, which is what bathtub gins and other hooches are designed to do. But the two things you get when you sacrifice quality and quantity for efficiency and cheapness is terrible taste.
Right.
And that coincides, though, with the rise of manufacturing industrialization and the amount of sugar that was readily available for very cheap.
And it's a thing that I'd really like to talk to an expert about, of exactly what happened, because my theory is America's big problem with sugar. And we have a lot of drug problems in this country, but I don't think that we have any bigger drug problem than processed sugar.
Big sugar, for sure.
It's the one. Big sugar is killing more people than fentanyl by far. Just as a quick Google search to back that up and explain what I mean, there is more than twice as many people killed on an annual basis in this country just from sugary drinks as opposed to fentanyl. So I am not undermining those deaths from fentanyl, not by a second. I've had good friends killed by it. That's not the point. The point is that we are killing a huge number of people with sugar, but we don't talk about it, because it's not a crime. It's just a horrible health consequence. But I think all of it starts right then in the 1920s. And it starts because we as a country are told that alcohol is bad, sugar is good, so let's switch to that.
If there's a constant with humanity, it's the need for vices. We love vices, whether it's alcohol or cannabis or sex addiction or sugar. We have to have an outlet for our whatever crazed desires. It doesn't matter.
I smoke weed to drink less. So
just substituting here.
Exactly.
But you look at like the biggest states that consume the most sugar, and in America, you're talking like Utah, where they just drink gallons of soda per person. It's because all those Mormons don't drink alcohol. Now, obviously, this is I'm going out on a limb here with this stuff and generalizing a lot of things. But you don't have in the Midwest, outside of going all the way to the west of Utah, this same level of drive-through soda culture that they have out there. And you know what Mormons don't drink? Alcohol. You know what they do is sugar.
Well, they also don't drink caffeine, but yes.
Well, let's look away from that.
Yeah. Your point, yes, your broader point is valid. The driest parts of this country are consuming crazy amounts of Mountain Dew. And they also have crazy rates of diabetes and other associated, and obesity and other associated health consequences.
So if we look at what sugar has done to our country and how it's impacted the tastes of beer and alcohol and basically everything we eat and consume anymore, you can just see the insidious nature of it. And you can see how we're just substituting one vice for the other. And I'm not saying sugar is worse than alcohol. And I'm not saying alcohol is better than sugar or whatever, vice versa.
Nobody drank a 6-pack of Mountain Dew and beat the piss out of their wife because of it. Fair enough.
Yes. But if you look back before the rise of industrialization, before the rise of cheap, easy, near-free sugar like we have today, beer was fitting in that niche. And I don't just mean from an alcohol standpoint. A lot of beer was drank throughout the day, all day. It was not nearly as fermented as well as it is today. It was not nearly as dry. You had things that were partially fermented, so there was a lot of residual sugar left over. So you're still getting your fix, you're getting your calories, you're getting everything you need out of it. All that changed with the rise of Prohibition. And that's the whole point of us railing on sugar here, is to say that Prohibition came at the perfectly wrong time in America for us to basically forever change what alcohol looks like.
Yeah, because that whole industrialization process fed into the rest of this stuff. What was enabling beer to change and become more consistent was also enabling us to produce other sorts of products more efficiently and on a mass level. So we get a lot of sweet things, and the point of this isn't to rail on the sugar industry. It's ultimately that the American palate is changed radically in that 13-year period of time. It becomes a lot more narrow. What do we like as a country? What is yummy? Sweet things, really, really sugary sweet things. What's not good? Bitter. That's disgusting. Who wants to taste anything bitter?
Mm-hmm.
So the palate is narrowed, no sour, no bitter, just sugar. And that's not good for beer.
No, because beer is based off of hops. Well, at least for the past 400 years. It is all about hops, and hops are bitter. They have a lot of fruit-like flavors, but at the end of the day, they contribute a bitterness to the beer. So all of a sudden, after Prohibition, we've basically killed what beer tastes like through the use of shitty malt extracts to make them probably overly sweet and raisiny and not good tasting. They didn't have much hops, if any, in them. And the hops certainly were not good tasting at that point in time, being made into a syrup. So all the two things that beer relies on, which is, well, three things. Good fermentation, which you weren't doing at home. I guarantee that in 1922.
You're using bread yeast.
You're using bread yeast. It had terrible malt flavor because
syrupy, shitty.
Just cooked to shit, dark, terrible grossness. And then the hops were probably skunky,
Completely
cheesy,
muted.
a mess. So everything that makes beer great was ruined. And this had a ripple effect, too, on all the farms and all the people growing it. The people growing barley had to switch crops. The people growing hops, which hops takes about 3 years to grow, to get to
start to turn a profit.
To start to turn a profit, and you need a ton of infrastructure. It's not like wheat where you just toss it in the ground and it grows up like a grass. It's got to grow up trellises, and you got to have huge supports and all this metal wire in place. It's a lot of investment.
Yeah, if you've never seen a hop farm, you can't just switch back. It's not like you plant tobacco one year and you plant soybeans the next. A hop farm, go check one out online or in person if you've never seen one. You have to plant a bunch of telephone poles.
Yes.
And then run a bunch of guide wires between it because hops are a vining plant. So there's a massive amount of infrastructure. Once you have created a hop farm and you have all that infrastructure in it, it takes you a while for the hops to grow big enough to be profitable. But beyond that, you can't just stop growing hops and grow something else. And that infrastructure is useless.
It is specialized for hops.
Yeah.
And hops specifically.
So it costs a lot of money to put in. And then if you don't have a market for hops, you got to rip all that out and start growing something else.
There is no market for hops outside of beer.
Right.
None. Yeah, you could put it in pillows or whatever new age bullshit they're trying to sell you on and whatever. But there's basically no market for hops. So if we want to get a little sidetracked here on hops, two things about hops. One, it's soporific, which means it puts you to sleep, which adds on to the depressive nature of alcohol in general. So if you drink a bunch of IPAs, you might get more tired than you would otherwise. But that's why they traditionally wanted pillows, because it helped make you tired. The second interesting thing about them is they're very high in hormones that create or cause puberty in women. And a lot of women, when they were first starting out on hop farms traditionally in Europe, they would help by packing hops into bags. And they noticed over time that girls growing up on hop farms would hit puberty and get their first periods a lot earlier than their classmates who didn't work on hop farms. So that's two very interesting things about hops.
So the hop farmer's daughter was a whole different category.
If you were a 12-year-old boy and she was a 12-year-old girl, yes, that was a whole different world for you, I'm sure.
Wow.
But anyway, the point is that all these hop farms, they had no more outlet for their hops. So boom, overnight, entire industry was gone. These farmers were ruined. And hops, prior to Prohibition, the main hop growing regions was New England. New York was the number one producer in America prior to Prohibition.
And Wisconsin was also huge. But New York was number one, Wisconsin was big. And neither one of them grow meaningful amounts of hops these days.
No, garbage amounts. New York's coming back a little bit for different reasons, but and the same thing happened to the wine and vines. And the number one wine growing region in America prior to Prohibition, which you would never be able to guess this state if you didn't know, Missouri. Of all states, fucking
I think it's
Missouri.
pronounced Missouri, but
Yes, you're right. Excuse me.
yeah, that is crazy.
And you just can't find wine there anymore. You can, but
Well, it sucks. It tastes like Indiana wine.
yes, which is a
A
shame.
bunch of sugar.
Because
It's
you know
really
what?
sweet.
Wine didn't taste like that grown in those regions prior to Prohibition.
Yeah.
It probably was legitimately good. That was probably the best wines in America used to come out of Missouri.
And when wine finally came back to those areas, Cincinnati was the original Napa Valley, or the Ohio River Valley, not just Cincinnati. But this whole area in the 1840s and 1850s, that was where wine really started to take off for the first time. And there was a fungus that killed all the wine crops here, and the Ohio River Valley lost all of its vineyards. Although we do still have in Augusta, Kentucky, the oldest operating vineyard in the United States is here in the Ohio River Valley. Yeah, those wines that they would have made at that period of time, would they be delicious by today's standards? No. But when winemaking comes back to Ohio, to Kentucky, to Indiana, to Missouri, to the Midwest in general, it's a bunch of sweet strawberry, peach nonsense. It's sugar.
Mm-hmm.
It's sweet. It's not balanced wines.
Sugar has taken over, and winemakers have realized that the only way that they're going to win back palates is by loading it up with sugar.
Yeah. So when we come out of Prohibition, one of the casualties of it was the American palate. People didn't like beer anymore. Budweiser is a perfect example. Budweiser brought back their pre-Prohibition recipe, exact same beer, pre-Prohibition. I mean, they had been for a long time the king of beers. They sold more beer than anybody else, and their beer was celebrated all around the world. Post-Prohibition, they re-released the exact same beer. It sells really well initially when people haven't had a beer, but then sales fall just straight off a cliff. And they discover that the reason for it is that Americans think that their beer is too bitter. Exact same beer as pre-Prohibition. And Budweiser only has 13 IBUs. So, for anybody that's not a beer nerd, what that means is it's very little hops in it.
13 IBUs is basically nothing in modern day craft beer.
Right. It ain't bitter.
No.
You're not tasting the hops in it. There's no bitterness out of it. But it was still too bitter for the general American palate because they'd gotten used to, if you drank beer during Prohibition, as we discussed, you're drinking homebrew mostly, made from some sappy, sweet can of whatever.
Overcooked malt syrup.
Yeah. So the whole idea of any amount of bitterness, any crispness, any hop flavor to it, that had been lost completely. So the result winds up being that beer as a beverage goes down in popularity. Americans start increasingly drinking less and less beer.
And that's not to say that they're not drinking alcohol. It's just that they're not drinking beer anymore. Spirits are on the rise, largely because of Prohibition. But the Americans continue to consume the same amount of alcohol as they've always consumed, which is about a gallon per person per year.
And beer, some of the numbers here, not to get overwhelming with statistics, but in 1914, when World War I started in Europe, we as a country were consuming over 66 million barrels of beer a year. 1934, 1 year out of Prohibition, we're only back up to about 38 million barrels of beer a year. So it's not like beer did this complete rebound. It does increase. By 1937, we are consuming almost 59 million barrels of beer a year. Still not what it was pre-World War I. But then it goes into decline. So we go from 1937 to 1941, we're down to 55 million barrels of beer a year.
And it never gets to where it was pre-Prohibition.
Right.
and we have more people in the U.S. And all of these things that you would think would indicate higher beer sales was not leading to higher beer sales.
Right. Not only a greater population in the 40s, but yeah, we killed off a bunch of people in World War I, and population starts to rebound. We have more people by 41 than we did before World War I started, and we're still consuming 10 million barrels of beer less.
So the breweries had to do something to compensate. The old school pre-pro recipes weren't working anymore, so they brought in the use of adjuncts.
As a brewer, you want to explain what the hell an adjunct is?
So an adjunct is anything that's not hops, barley, water, yeast. So that means other grains like wheat and rice. It could mean crazy ass shit, corn. It could mean crazy stuff like it does today where it's cupcakes and Oreos, but it's basically anything that's not those four main ingredients of beer. And in 1934 term, adjuncts were corn and rice.
And so Reinheitsgebot gets passed in 1516, I think. And Reinheitsgebot is the world's oldest food purity law, and it says that beer can only be made of those four ingredients. And that's traditional German brewing tradition. So in the United States, we start off as a country that makes a lot of English, UK-like beers. We transition with immigration patterns to being a country whose beers are defined by Germanness. And when we did that transition, we kept that respect for Reinheitsgebot. And the idea that you would use anything but those ingredients was a shortcut. It was never the law here in the United States like it was in Germany, but it was tradition among German brewers that if you were using other grains, predominantly if you were using rice or corn, then your beer was shit. It was a shortcut. You were making a worse beer. People were kind of ashamed of it, kind of walked away from it. Sometimes breweries denied using rice or corn. By the time we're headed into the late 1930s, they're proud of it. And they're using a lot of them.
And this arguably is when the first light beer was created. It was made because Prohibition forced people away from preferring bitterness, and it forced these breweries to use adjuncts and to market as having lighter, easier drinking beers.
The beer got lighter and more watery, but people still preferred something else. They still preferred sweeter beverages. And a new generation of youth just wasn't catching on to beer. Going into Prohibition, there was around about 1,400 breweries nationwide. Post-Prohibition, 1934, there's 756. So we have this dramatic drop in the number of breweries. And it's in part because only the biggest ones can really survive it. Those ones that had a lot of tied houses, they owned a bunch of real estate. So they could become landlords during Prohibition, and or they could just sell off those assets. They also were big enough and had enough capital behind them that they could convert to other uses. And you take a brewery like Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch, in the first few years of Prohibition, it started to hemorrhage money. I mean, it lost $2.5 million in the first year of Prohibition. And we're talking about 1919 money, right? So that's a lot. There's not a lot of companies out there. They lost $2.5 million in 1919, $1.6 million in 1920, $1.3 million in 1921.
That's like over $100 million combined in today's money.
That you just hemorrhaged in 3 years.
An insane amount of money.
There's not a lot of companies that can manage that. And in fact, Anheuser-Busch's two biggest competitors in St. Louis, those breweries went under when the owners both committed suicide. Which is definitely my business is not doing well at all final stage. It's a very sad period of time for people that had put their lives into that industry. So you have to be big. You have to be really, really big to make it through Prohibition.
And to put those numbers into finite terms, we're talking when they first started taking excise tax and recording how many breweries were in this country in 1865, there's 2,200 breweries. By the time Prohibition started, there was about 1,300 breweries, so roughly half. That was all through consolidation and industrialization.
Yeah.
When we finally got through Prohibition, which the only people who made it through Prohibition, as Mike was just saying, are those who did capitalism the best and saved the most money, we're down to half again. So in 1865 to 1915, boom, half. 1915 to 1934, boom, half. We're down to 750 breweries in the country. That's barely anything for the amount of population growth we saw over those same years.
So you have much fewer breweries, and you have a country that has changed its palate, so they don't really like the taste of beer, even Budweiser. And Budweiser, I will shit on it, and I'm not going to stop. But really, when you look back at the history of Budweiser, it became Budweiser, it became the king of beers, because it was a really good American version of a German Pilsner. They did it great.
With how much we learned about the history of Budweiser and researching all of this for season 1.5, I really wish Budweiser was still American, because I would drink the shit out of it right now.
Yeah.
Because it is so distinctly an American story, the success, the rise, and the plateauing of Budweiser. It's truly amazing.
It's not pretty all across the board. They did some heinous things as an American company.
Well, that's America for you.
That is America for you. It was, however, a really iconic American brand.
And for those of you who don't know, they're owned by a Brazilian venture capitalist group now. So
yeah, Budweiser ain't, despite the fact that you will now pick it up sometimes around July and it's called America, it ain't American.
No.
They're a foreign-owned brand. You see it in the domestic aisle, ironically, where craft beer is not sold. But
yeah, it's owned by foreign entities.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
And for worse. But InBev is not going to sponsor this podcast, so fuck InBev. Not because they're not going to sponsor this podcast. I'm just not afraid to say it. I mean, I don't know. What does that mean? I am a whore. Perhaps if they're going to write a check big enough, I'll
Well, they're not
that.
banana importers, so we're not going to get killed by fucking paramilitary groups that they're hiring to do coups in South America. So it's not Dole level bad yet. So maybe we'll get there one day. But right now, beer terrorism is an all-time low.
But the point is that Budweiser was a really good American-style Pilsner. And it became the king of beers because people loved it, because they knocked it out of the park, and because although they were using rice, they were still using all natural ingredients. They weren't using any chemicals. They weren't using any syrups. They were using nothing but water, yeast, barley, hops, and rice.
And it wasn't until recently that they used the best quality rice they could get. There was no rice chunks. There was no rice husks. It was just whole kernel rice, polished just ever so slightly, just like they do in sake, to make the best possible rice. Then they used that from the get-go. It was not cheaper than barley. America's not great for growing rice. It was more expensive. They were spending the money to fit the changing American palate. And so you probably have heard time and time again, if you use rice, you're using cheaper ingredients, blah, blah, blah. No, they spent more money to make a better suited product to the new consumer palate.
But what better suited meant, going back to the 1870s, was lighter bodied, yellow, clearer,
less beer tasting beer.
Less beer tasting beer. So that's what rice was doing. And they were spending more money, and they were doing it well. They were knocking it out of the park. But that's what America wanted, was less flavorful beer. And they did it spectacularly. But post-Prohibition, Budweiser sales took off out of the gate because everybody can't wait to start drinking again. And man, it's been 13 years since I've had a Budweiser, so I can't wait to drink one of those. And their sales were gangbusters. And then they fell off a cliff. And there was a whole controversy. There were people within Anheuser-Busch that said, we should cut down on the hops in this beer. And to their credit, Anheuser-Busch at the time said, no, we are not going to do that. We're going to hold the line. This is a good product. We're going to continue making it. And the consumer is going to eventually pull their head out of their ass, and they're going to learn to like good beer again. And then a funny thing happens, and that's World War II. And what happens with beer in World War II is very different from World War I. World War I, because American breweries were all owned by ethnic Germans, it gets wrapped up in the war. But the breweries had learned their lesson. So breweries, the big ones that are still all owned by ethnic Germans, they immediately go patriotic as shit. And they're all about America. They're all about, let's help sell war bonds. Let's do everything we can to support the war effort. And they cut deals with the government, the American government, the military. Made a deal with the breweries that we're going to make beer an essential ration for the troops. So not only is beer not evil, but we're going to give it to American forces in the field.
Which is, there's a long history in militaries of plying troops with alcohol.
Right.
So this is nothing new.
As part of that deal that the United States military made with the big breweries, and that's another thing, is that Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz and Pabst, it's the big boys that are getting these massive government contracts. But part of those contracts was that they had to make 3.2% beer. So there are radical ways that beer drinking gets changed just during the course of World War II. When you go into World War II, 70% of the grain that's going into beer on average is barley. Midway through the war, you reach a point where only half of what's going into the grain part of your beer is barley, and the other half of it is stuff.
And that's not because barley was being used for other things. It's because literally farmers were being told by the government to stop growing barley and start growing other shit that we can use in the war.
As food.
Yes.
That means that you have less barley. You also have less access to corn and less access to rice. So a bunch of other crazy shit starts going into beer. Potatoes.
Monk fruit. Dirt. Crabs. I don't know if those three things were going in. I made that up.
I don't think, but but there was a lot. There were a lot of different kind of adjuncts, different syrups and different sweetening agents that they started using in beers. And all these beers, again, they're 3.2% beers. So beer gets watery and it gets full of all sorts of additional adjuncts, other chemicals.
Anything that they could get that was fermentable was getting used because all available food supplies were being redirected towards the war effort.
And you do have to hand it to breweries of this era that they were inventive. I mean, the fact that they're figuring out how to continue to ramp up production of beer while they're being denied the base ingredients to do it. And there are some freaks out there figuring out how to make beer with potatoes or whatever crap is available. It's inventive, but it's like making prison wine. The goal is I made it and it got me drunk, not that it was good.
Yes. And that's when we also saw the rise of specific grains and styles of beer that are prominent to this day. 6-row barley became necessary to use because it had a higher protein content, which means it has higher enzymatic power, which means you can use things like rotten potatoes to make a beer with. Otherwise, you just be left with starch soup. 6-row barley is a type of barley that grows on the stalk in 6 distinct rows. It means that the kernels are a little bit smaller than 2-row barley, which is the main brewing grain. 2-row barley has only 2 rows on a stalk. Now, when you have 6-row barley and you have these smaller kernels, you have more protein per kernel weight. That means that I'm going to have more enzymatic power, and that enzymatic power is what takes starches and turns it into carbohydrates, i.e. sugars, that the yeast can then ferment, and away you go. You get alcohol. So if you have potatoes, which doesn't have any enzymatic power to turn starches into sugars for the yeast to then turn into alcohol, you need to have barley that has an excess of enzymes in it, an excess of protein. And that's where 6-row barley really came into its own, is it has the excess of enzymes. It can take the starches from potatoes or other starch-heavy foods or grains, and it can convert them into sugars that the yeast then can convert into alcohol.
Yeah. So we see this huge shift that occurs with the greatest generation. First of all, the amount of beer they consumed went up dramatically. So as a result of the fact that so many young men are in Europe and they're having American beers shipped over to them, there's a whole new generation that starts to like beer. Your numbers start to not only tick up, but they finally, for the first time, go back to way beyond what they were pre-World War I. So post-World War II, we have gone from being down to 55 million barrels a year as a country. 1945, by the time the war's over, we're up to almost 87 million barrels a year. By 1948, we're up to 91 million barrels a year. So beer not only comes back, but it comes back with a vengeance. And people also start to even drink it differently in a physical sense. And that's the beer can. The beer can was first released in 1935. So it had been around before World War II. People bought beer in the can.
And that, up until that time, was not the preferred method. There was associated off flavors because can liners weren't really invented yet. It was difficult to open the can. And there was a lot of things that people just didn't like about it. This was for food. It wasn't for a drinking liquid.
Today, if you think that there is a significant taste difference between beer from a can versus beer from a bottle, it's in your head. There isn't. But back then, there actually would have been. Not only a difference in the taste, but you probably would have got some little lead in it, which is good for you, as we know, a little sweetness to it. But not only that, it was those original cans. Everybody's probably seen pictures of those cone top cans. And for people like collect beer cans, they're worth $1 gazillion because there weren't a lot of brands making them, and they weren't very popular. But they had this little cone top, kind of like a bottle, and they had they basically unscrewed like a bottle. Mm-hmm. So you didn't drink straight from it. You poured it into a glass like a civilized person. Then we have the modern beer can come out in World War II because it's like any other army ration. You have to be able to consume it in the field. You're not bringing a pint glass with you. So it's the first time that the can is designed for people to drink directly from it.
And with the cone top, you're losing out on a lot of logistical benefits as well. That was extremely important when you're shipping things overseas. With the cone top, you can't stack it very well. It's going to be a little bit heavier because there is more material, and it just all around costs more, and it doesn't fit into a nice little ration box. If you have a nice flat top and flat bottom cylinder that's as small as it can possibly be, with as thin as walls as it possibly can be, you have amazing shipping capacity, and it fits into any pack size that the troop needs.
So World War II completely revolutionized how we drank beer as a country. Number one, in turning a whole new generation onto beer. Number two, to turning them on to bad beer. And number three, turning them on to drinking beer straight from a can. And the big winners wound up being the really big breweries that not only grew bigger because of these government contracts, but they grew bigger because of brand loyalty. I mean, it is the ultimate moment of brand loyalty. You and I have shitty days, but it is very rare that either one of us gets shot at in the course of the workday. Nothing's going to make a beer taste better than I didn't get shot today, and it's a very realistic possibility that that would have happened.
Physical and emotional trauma create intense bonds.
Yeah. I mean, if I make it through a firefight, that Schlitz is not only going to be delicious, but man, I am going to drink Schlitz for the rest of my life.
In a foxhole with their buddy, with their life on the line. And that Budweiser got you through the night. You know what you're going to drink when you get home and safe on your turf?
I'm going to drink the shit out of that Budweiser.
Yeah, you're going to drink the shit out of that Budweiser because
Yeah.
that shit got you home safe.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that is the ultimate brand loyalty right there.
So by getting these troops associated with drinking beer from the can, getting them used to basically what is low quality products, and getting this palate developed for it, when everybody came home and they were starting families and the industrial boom was happening and people had money to spend and they wanted to drink more, well, what were they going to drink? They drank what they knew and they drank what they were comfortable with.
Bad, watery beer straight from the can.
And this further led to more consolidation in the beer industry, and we lost more breweries because of this. Because if you landed one of those government contracts to supply the troops overseas, and you were given money to install canning lines and to grow your brewery, you were already getting a huge leg up on the competition. And then when people came back home and they wanted to drink even more, you already had the infrastructure in place that these smaller breweries didn't have.
Every crisis really benefits the people that go into it with the most capital and the most money and the most ability to survive it. I mean, Prohibition did the same thing. You know, it's not like Prohibition was good for Anheuser-Busch in the short term or during Prohibition, but it was good for it in the long term in that it killed off so much of the competition.
Half their competition was gone.
Right. So next episode, we're going to take that story up from about the 1950s and talk about how advertising really came in, and big ad agencies and big ad dollars were the death knell that killed any sort of flavor in American beer. Brett, can I ask you, before we go, a personal question? Have you ever made prison wine?
Yes. Yes.
At the Attica days? Was it the...
Yeah, back in college days in Athens, yes. There was literally closet wine that got made and sold on my dorm room floor.
Yeah, we did that. We did that too.
Yeah.
It was... Yeah, I had a friend's dad that was in Vietnam, and he wasn't necessarily what you call a good influence, but he taught us, how he made wine in Vietnam, and we weren't getting shot at OU either, but we did need to get drunk underage, so we had a whole closet that was full of really bad homemade wine.
Well, in the wise words of Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way.
If you think that, like right now, we're maybe a 4-star podcast, maybe a 3.5-star podcast, we're learning. We're getting better. We suck less every day. So just go ahead and give us the 5 stars, because you can see the future, that we really, are that 5-star podcast. We're drunk for part of the season 1.
You gotta will our 5 stars into existence. Help us out here. Visualize it, become it. Thank you for your support. Until next week.
We love you guys. Cheers to you.
Cheers.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom-and-pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.